we're plotting segments of the various comedies on the two components, PC1 on the horizontal axis, PC2 on the vertical axis. We've got 12 Shakespeare comedies divided into 111 segments of 2,000 words, 54 comedies by others divided into 534 segments. So the grey there are the segments by others, 534. The red diamonds are Shakespeare comedies divided into 111 segments. Divided into segments to take account of local variation. So we're not crushing wild differences within the plays into a single count. By choosing the 40 Shakespeare markers as the basis for this analysis, we increase the likelihood that Shakespeare versus non-Shakespeare difference would emerge, and that is what has happened. The Shakespeare segments with red diamonds as markers are predominantly to the higher, that is the right-hand end of PC1, horizontal axis. Obviously, this is not a clear enough separation to serve for an authorship study, but nevertheless, there's a strong tendency in the segments, enough to label PC1 as, among other things, a Shakespeare, non-Shakespeare factor. Figure 2 projects the word weightings on the same axes, so that segments at either end of, say, PC1 will tend to have higher frequencies of words that appear at that end and lower frequencies of words that appear at the other end. The extreme low weighting for PC1 at the left-hand end is has, as you can see. Thus, the Shakespeare segments will have fewer instances of has. The extreme high weighting to the right is for thou, down the bottom there. The labels are slightly misleading. It's actually thou has the highest weighting, the highest positive weighting. And so we can expect a Shakespeare segment to have, on the whole, more instances of thou than other segments. Thee and thy appear near thou on the chart, on the bottom right there. They appear together. They're evidently words that regularly appear together in the texts. Once you get an instance of thou, it's likely that there'll be a thee and a thy not too far away. That's what we'd expect. The more interesting finding is that these words tend to appear at a high rate in Shakespeare comedy segments. Thou forms were giving way quickly to you forms over the years represented by these plays. Comparing figures 1 and 2, we find that generally in comedy, Shakespeare lagged behind in use of these forms compared to his contemporaries. Moving back from the right-hand end of the chart and sort of more towards the middle, we meet hath, another form in retreat in the language, only it seems predominating, or Shakespeare is using more of hath compared to his peers. Moving further into the center from the right-hand end, we find the conjunction that. Now, this is less obviously a kind of old-fashioned form or a lagging form than thou or hath, but it is in decline over the period. And declining use of that as a conjunction follows a general change in the language noted by historical linguists in the direction of omitting the conjunction that in cases where you could include it or not. Both would be equally idiomatic. Linguists agree, I've got 3 of them lined up in the footnote, that omission is commoner in modern English in less formal language and in speech. So there's a kind of historical trend to have fewer that's as a conjunction appearing. And we might speculate that the historical trend towards increasing use of the zero form, i.e. not having a that in a sentence, in the early modern period and in the drama, is a move towards informality and an imitation of everyday speech. Just to illustrate these 2 options, retention or zero, I'll just show you, this is a speech from Touchstone in As You Like It. He's talking about the The Life of the Shepherd. The first sentence here has two examples of retention. The playwright or the character puts in that in two instances, and the second sentence has two examples of deletion. In respect that it is solitary, that is the shepherd's life, in respect that it is solitary, I like it very well. But in respect that it is private, it is a very vile life. Now in respect it is in the fields, it pleaseth me well. See, he's deleted that there. It's not now in respect that it is in the fields. Now in respect it is in the fields, it pleaseth me well. But in respect it is not in the court, it is tedious. Yeah, I don't know if we can hear any sort of archaic or kind of resonance there, but that's the kind of presumption, including that is a little bit more archaic. At the low end of PC1, moving in from has, we find your, the incoming form of the second person possessive, formerly exclusively plural, but increasingly in this period singular as well. And there are other cases which might hint at some sort of historical linguistic drift, such as are at the low value end of PC1, just about on the axis there, whose positioning there may well be connected with the increase in you forms, or more exactly, the decrease in thou forms. People were saying you are instead of thou art. So are was increasing, but not in Shakespeare. Well, that's as may be. But even if we confine ourselves to obvious cases of incoming and outgoing forms, we have the five word variables with extreme high weightings, all outgoing forms. So that the five highest scoring to the right there, word variables, are all outgoing forms, and the two variables at the extreme lower end, that is has and your, are incoming forms. And we know that Shakespeare's at the other end, the right-hand end. So we can sum up the most striking differences in function word use in Shakespeare comedy compared to comedy by others is that Shakespeare comedy favors the outgoing forms. If we, I'm not going to do this, but if we identify the source plays for the segments which appear at the low value end of PC1 and Figure 1, the grey data points towards the left, we find many of them are from city comedies. Of the 10 lowest, 7 are from 6 Middleton plays, 2 from a Fletcher play, and 1 from a Johnson play. All of these plays are set in contemporary London. Sort of to the extreme left tend to be plays set in contemporary London. And we might say this is a region of the chart where Shakespeare does not go. He occupies only part of the range of drama of his time. In comedy, he does not write strikingly contemporary dialogue focusing on the commercial, everyday interchange of the England of his time. You know, he's not a satirical realist. We can press this a little more, if you'll indulge me, by looking at individual words and dividing the plays by era, seeing how often they're used in plays from 1599 before and in plays from 1600 and after, making the end of 1599 our division between the two periods. So this gives you scores for, or counts for hath, one of those retreating words. We got on the first, it's not exactly a box and whisker, I don't know what you call that that range. These are confidence intervals. So you've got the average, which is the circle, and then the bar up and down shows you the 95% confidence interval for these counts. A 95% confidence interval is a range of values that we can be 95% certain contains the true mean of the population of which this is a sample. It tells us, in other words, how much the counts vary around the mean. So we got Shakespeare comedy before 1600, first on the left. That's 8 plays with 73 segments. And then Also from the early period, 12 non-Shakespeare comedies with 113 segments. Shakespeare higher. He uses more hath in the early period. And then moving to the right there, we've got Shakespeare comedy after 1599. These are 4 plays with 38 segments. And non-Shakespeare comedy after 1599, 42 plays and 421 segments. So generally things are declining. If you just look at Shakespeare, he declines a little bit from the first period to the second. If you look at the second and last symbol there, other people are declining much more quickly. But Shakespeare's kind of following, but he's following the trend, but he remains higher. He's slower to change than others. Yes, Shakespeare's average for hath is higher than his peers in both periods and markedly higher in the second. If you look at just the 2 right-hand ones there, Shakespeare is way above in the use of hath. The confidence intervals indicate that there's a wider variation in counts in the Shakespeare segments in the non-Shakespeare ones. It has longer, Shakespeare has longer bars, but the ranges only just overlap in the early period and there's a wide gap in the later period. If we consider the 2 Shakespeare periods on their own, allowing the eye to skip the intervening mean and range, i.e. just look at numbers 1 and 3 there, we see that his frequency of use does decline in line with what we know is happening in the language. Meanwhile, the use of hath declines sharply in the non-comedy segments. Sorry, the non-Shakespeare comedy segments. Okay, so much for hath. We've got one last chart to show you, which is has. The corresponding incoming form is has. And this time, Shakespeare is sharply lower in both periods. And that's quite a spectacular change. I mean, this is a very, very common word. And these are the sort of function words are sort of by definition a sort of closed class, very stable. It takes quite a lot to shift people's use of words like this, but it's quite a spectacular change around this 1599 to 1600 period. And Shakespeare is kind of markedly, sharply below in both periods. By the post-1599 period, Shakespeare is exceeding the use of his peers in the earlier period as a testimony to the overall current of advance in the use of the word, but his peers have moved even more strongly, so he continues to lag behind them in the later period as much as he did in the early one. Dividing the periods into 2 like this helps to show that there's something more than simply the presence of successive generations at work here. The change, for one thing, is happening within the Shakespeare canon, and we can assume that other playwrights individually are changing in their use of has as well. If we simply compare 2 playwrights regardless of time period, as Jonathan Hope has done for Shakespeare and Fletcher, it may well be that we have to conclude that sociolinguistic factors rather than stylistic choices explain Fletcher's higher use of prestige in coming forms, in Jonathan's words. For one thing, Fletcher was born 15 years later, and for another, he was brought up in London rather than in Warwickshire like Shakespeare. But the picture is quite different with the set of 11 pre-1600 non-Shakespeare comedies used for figures 3 and 4. Oh, sorry, the 2 previous figures. They're by 8 different authors, of whom 5 have known dates and places of birth, and 3 of these 5 were born before Shakespeare, and like him, outside London. So it's hard to see a generational difference in the 2 left-hand data points there. Thus, we cannot easily explain the differences in Shakespeare's usage of the incoming and outgoing forms in the earlier period as a matter of generations, or of upbringing in the provinces rather than in London. Then we have to concede that by the time of the second period, the post-1599 one, there were younger entrants. Shakespeare obviously his birthday didn't change, but new people were coming in. And some of Shakespeare's tendency to greater archaism may be explained by the generational factors in the second. It's a better explanation in the second, for part of the change at least, in the second group. And beyond this, it is hard to go. We can only speculate about the causes that lie behind these patterns of usages. An unknown mixture of broader factors was at work: social, regional, and generational background, as I've mentioned, unconscious personal disposition, and artistic choice. Has is taken up very quickly, as I've said, by the dramatists. It is really a lecture about has, great word, as I've become a great favourite of mine. Shakespeare, has was taken up very quickly by the dramatists, but hath remained available and persisted in very common use, at least until the 18th century. The novelist Henry Fielding, for instance, in the 18th century, strongly preferred hath, while his sister Sarah used has almost exclusively in her novel. So it kind of remained, you could go either way for a couple more centuries. Shakespeare characters can regularly use the two forms, has and hath, in close proximity. And my assumption is, or my proposal is, that when this happens, hath has a slight archaic resonance for the audience. And admittedly, for this, we're just relying on what the modern ear tells us about examples of these two forms once they're foregrounded. The Tempest gives, Shakespeare's late play, The Tempest, provides example of characters who use both forms. Caliban does this in a single speech, uses both hath and has. He's talking about Prospero. Remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot, as I am, nor hath not one spirit to command. They all do hate him as rootedly as I. Burn but his books, he has brave utensils, for so he calls them, which when he has a house, he'll deck withal. So there's a hath at the beginning there and two hases, still in play. Ferdinand in the same play uses hath twice and has once. He has followed the music of the island, or it hath drawn me, rather, he says, and he refuses to follow Prospero when they first meet, till mine enemy has more power. Just to cover briefly the other forms, along with has, the newer form your emerged in the PCA as far out to the left hand, as I mentioned, to the negative end of PC1, where Shakespeare's segments are scarce, while the three archaic thou forms, and that as a conjunction, are highlighted as contributed to the positive end, where Shakespeare's overrepresented. So if we do the same and divide the plays into two periods, we find that your is similar in frequency in Shakespeare and in the others in the early period, but distinctly lower in the later period. If we combine the three thou forms, we find that Shakespeare's use is higher than that of his peers in both periods, but the difference is greater in the later one. And the pattern with that as a conjunction is similar. Higher in Shakespeare in both periods, with a greater gap between the ranges in the later one. Thus, Shakespeare tends to use more of the older forms and fewer of the newer ones across the board. So these observations lead to my main conclusion. If you identify the very common words with the biggest differences between Shakespeare and his peers in comedy, one important group that emerges is words which were changing in rates of use at the time. And in his use of these words, Shakespeare lags rather than leads. If we focus on individual words within the group of advancing and retreating forms, we find that Shakespeare usually lags behind the historical trend in comedies performed before 1600, as well as those performed after 1599, although the pattern is clearer in the later period. So I'll go on to say where I think that takes us as far as any sort of conclusions about Shakespeare. But I just look quickly at genres other than comedies to look across the board. They don't give us as satisfactory a corpus, as I mentioned at the beginning, but there's still some hope of a reliable insight. I'll continue to focus on the thou forms, combined into a single variable, and on the other words already singled out, your, hath, has, and that as a conjunction. And again, I'll base this all on 2,000 word segments. Okay, I have 129 plays in the set, if you take in all genres. In the full set, which of course includes the comedies, they're all used at consistently different rates in Shakespeare and elsewhere, with Shakespeare lagging by using fewer of the incoming and more of the outgoing forms, as we're familiar. If we divide the corpus in two by period, 1590 to 9 and 1600 to 14, we get a more mixed result. In the later period, the differences are all significant and in the direction we've come to expect, but in the early period, 3 of the differences are not significant. So the pattern of a sharper difference in 1600 to 1614 continues. Shakespeare lagging behind his contemporaries more as time goes on. The two best prospects for a reasonably well-populated, time-neutral and genre-neutral comparison beyond the comedies are early histories and middle tragedies. There are 6 Shakespeare history plays dated 1590 to 9 and 6 Shakespeare tragedies dated 1600 to 9. So I'm getting down to sort of smaller change here. In the corpus are corresponding sets by date and genre of 6 and 13. I've got 6 early histories by others and 13 middle tragedies by others. So if we compare counts for the segments as before, we find only 3 significant differences out of the 10 tested, Ure and Hath for the early histories, and that as a conjunction for the tragedies. So the strong pattern that we've been following is a little bit attenuated in these very focused sets. But the hypothesis that Shakespeare is a traditionalist in language is not contradicted, since in the cases where there is a significant difference, Shakespeare follows the usual pattern. But you don't get that much support for the hypothesis from those smaller sets. There's one earlier published study of the dialogue of Shakespeare-era tragedies and history plays in relation to the language changes of the time by Michael Ingram and Richard Ingram. And this shows that what they choose to focus on is 1603 to 13 works, and some much earlier ones, as I mentioned. And they show that Shakespeare makes more use of 2 archaic constructions, subject-verb inversion, as in, now shalt thou feel the force of Turkish arms, quoting from Marlowe, and inversion rather than do support in interrogatives. Liveth Balthazar, our son, from Spanish tragedy. So Shakespeare, according to Ingram and Ingram, again uses more of the archaic forms than his contemporaries. In Ingram and Ingram's view, this is, quoting, presumably because the high style effects they created suited his purpose in the dramatic context of his middle period and later plays. Okay, so let's return to the comedy set now, which is conveniently unequivocal in its result, and explore the implications of the main finding presented in this paper, i.e. Shakespeare's archaism in the language of comedy. Shakespeare generally is celebrated as an innovator in language. It's a commonplace that he invented many English words, which have since become part of everyday usage, and introduced other words to the printed record for the first time. He may well be, as Jonathan has proposed, an innovator in grammar as well, characteristically transforming the usual word order and grammatical sequence of the language. So the claim that I'm making, that he lags behind in some language changes, contradicts this picture of Shakespeare as language innovator. On the other hand, it fits well with the view that his work only rarely depicts contemporary England. Of the 38 plays traditionally associated with him, only The Merry Wives of Windsor is set in his own country in his own time. The domestic tragedy Arden of Faversham, which we now think he collaborated on, would add another one, but that's still only 2 plays which have got contemporary English settings. And Shakespeare drew on a wide range of sources for his plots, idea, and dialogue, including classical, French, and Italian works, to supplement his use of English history and folklore. So the overall picture, to me at least, is of a dramatic world, a Shakespeare dramatic world, extending deep in time and wide in geography, rather than focusing on contemporary England. Of course, Shakespeare did focus on England in his early history plays, But it was an England of previous centuries, even if often with a forward glance to what England might become. Then, with the accession of James VI of Scotland to become James I of England, 1603, Shakespeare's plays shifted attention to the larger entity of Britain. England kind of disappears after 1603, and Britain predominates. There are 159 instances of the word England in the sole author Shakespeare plays performed before 1603, and then just 3 in the plays afterwards. So, as I say, England almost disappears. And while there are only 12 mentions of Britain in plays before 1603, there are 34 in plays after 1603. So kind of they cross over. Britain's on the rise, England on the decline. Shakespeare's conservative response to the language changes of his day, as I argue, fits well with the fact that Shakespeare's plays, unlike those of Jonson and Middleton, do not include details of contemporary commercial activities, like printing. In the wider Shakespeare canon, only Henry VI Part 1, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and The Winter's Tale make unmistakable references to the world of print. There's a single passage in each. And a book, when mentioned in Shakespeare dialogue, is, I think this is right, never specifically associated with print. And where there is some added detail, it's often evident that when he's referring to a book, when the dialogue's referring to a book, the reference is to a manuscript book or a divinely maintained record like the Book of Life. Jonson, on the other hand, based an entire play, The Staple of News, on the newly emerged trade in printing news. Shakespeare, by contrast, makes very sparing reference to the printing trade or to any other innovative commercial enterprise of the day. Now, as I said at the beginning, Shakespeare has long been associated with England and Englishness. The fact that Shakespeare is overall a laggard in language fits a picture of his work as tending to enshrine the past on stage rather than to depict the present. If his plays do address England as a nation and Englishness, in line with Hamlet's speech on the function of drama, which I mentioned, to hold up the mirror up to nature, then the linguistic data just discussed suggests that this would be in terms of origins and antecedents, myth and history, rather than in terms of a reflection of the England of the present. If we accept that audiences either consciously or unconsciously perceived Shakespeare's language as archaic by comparison with the speech of the other plays they might have been going to see at the time, then it's likely that they saw the onstage world of the plays and the mental world of the characters as separate from the present and inflected as traditional or allied with the realm of poetry and invention. Whatever connection there was to the society of the contemporary world outside the theatre would be indirect. So, just to conclude, Shakespeare comedy lags rather than leads in the markers of historical change in the forms of English. Speeches have a touch of elegiac formality. They echo the contemporary, commonplace, material world less than the run of plays of his time. His dramatic worlds tend to be more traditional, perhaps more mythopoetic in orientation. The comedy data suggests that if Shakespeare does concern himself with an English nationhood emerging in his time, it's through the medium of an archaic style of dialogue. If he does believe that the purpose of drama is to hold a mirror to contemporary reality, then in his own practice, he requires that the dramatic world be, in the first instance, removed from the here and now. Overall, the function word analysis fits better with displacement from contemporary England and fits well with an orientation to the past and to a wider European tradition. Of course, elements of this creative world could be applied to the ideas, events, and personalities of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and audiences no doubt did this, and fervently, seeing connections between what they see on stage and the world around them. But the plays start as representations of other times and places, with resonances of a disappearing world rather than an emerging one. Thank you very much.